All right, so we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am the lead on the Conservation Stories Canada project, in which over the entire course of the year, I'll be featuring stories of amazing people working to protect wild species and wild habitats across Canada. I am so thrilled today to be joined by Mateen Hessami. He's had the immense privilege of getting to work with some of Canada and the United States conservation leaders. His work has taken him across both countries, and he's been lauded by a wide array of some of the top nature organizations in the world. Mateen, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
No problem, Jesse. Happy to be here and look forward to the interview.
Awesome. So where are you joining us from today? I really want to start with that to give you a chance to highlight the land that you're on today.
Yeah, so I have the privilege of being on campus at UBC Okanagan. We're kind of partially open, and that allows us to come in. And UBC's campus sits on the traditional territory of the Syilx people. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And very happy to be able to be in person on campus to do research.
Lucky you. Well, today's interview is going to be a little bit different than some of my other ones in that we're talking about a unique and fascinating topic to me personally. So when I was a kid, I had no one in my family, none of my friends ever hunted. They never fished. My entire experience of understanding hunting was in images of poachers, people that would take animals that were endangered from the wild. And so that was the bias that I had as a child that led into my adult life, where it's only recently that I've started to hear stories about the other side of conservation, the other side of hunting. And so I'd like you to start by telling me a little bit about your own experiences as a young man with hunting and fishing and what communities you grew up in.
Yeah, so to start things off, I shared a similar sentiment to you, a cautious one about hunting. And the first half of my life, I grew up in the concrete jungle of Vancouver, British Columbia. And I remember seeing on commercials, hunters and trappers kind of being portrayed as groups of people who didn't have wildlife in their best interest. And I moved to the United States when I was 13 years old. I moved to Spokane, Washington. And that is when I started to hunt with my uncle just across the border in Idaho. And we went out, in the kind of north central mountains of Idaho as a young teenager. And my uncle, I give him a lot of credit for introducing me not only to hunting, but the ethics, the conservation value behind it. And I clearly remember hunting with my uncle and kind of questioning everything. When we would hunt a specific clear cut, I was curious to what about this clear cut led deer, elk to select for it, or when we walked in a roadless area, did we see more wildlife? So my mind's kind of been churning since the moment that my uncle took me out.
Yeah.
And I have had the privilege of hunting in different communities from north central Idaho, also to Missoula, Montana, where I did my undergrad, and recently back to British Columbia. So I have observed some unique differences in kind of the management systems that different countries and states employ, which has been really interesting and which has shaped my interest to wildlife conservation.
Yeah, so you're a researcher, you do conservation across both countries. Now, you work with hunting and angling groups, both at the student level and beyond. Why is that way of interacting with nature so valuable to you? Like, what specifically about hunting and angling draws you to it, as opposed to just going out for a hike, as opposed to getting out with a natural group, as opposed to just doing conservation work on the land? Why hunting and angling?
Yes, that's a great question, Jesse. And I think to kind of the intimate connection that hunting has afforded me to the landscape, being able to be present in ecosystems that moose, elk, caribou share. And it's a unique perspective to be able to pursue that animal for food, and to be able to kind of see through the lens of, the lens of a human, but still how that species interacts with the landscape and kind of what they require to be abundant and what limits their population growth. So that's a couple of things that for me hunting affords, and something that I've been really grateful to loop into my wildlife conservation research.
Yeah. So you mentioned hunting and conservation a couple times, and I want you to help us make that link. I think when a lot of people, certainly when myself as a young man, thought about hunting, it was the antithesis of conservation. It's the exact opposite. Why kill something if you want to protect it? So your own research has touched upon this in a lot of ways, and please share your insight on how we can reconcile those two, seemingly very disparate things.
Definitely. I think to a quote that I heard in my undergrad, I can't tell you exactly who said it, but it stuck with me. And that is a resource is as cherished as it is utilized. And with hunting, I feel that hunters throughout North America and throughout the world are so interested in keeping that resource on the landscape, kind of perpetuating that animal so that not just they can benefit for it for food security purposes, for livelihood, for culture, but also that next generation. And I think that's how hunting has really shaped conservation, is because, in my opinion, there's no group that has a greater vested interest in not only the wildlife that they pursue, but also the landscape and the habitat that they depend on. And I guess I'll give you a couple examples, Jesse. I think especially to North America and kind of the system of conservation that we've developed. And I think to kind of colonial expansion when Europeans landed in North America, and especially when they started to move westward in the mid 19th century, 19th and 20th century, there was a lot of pressure on wildlife, large mammals. We hear about what happened to plains bison and the market hunting that surrounded them, or the extinction of the passenger pigeon and many other wildlife kind of were victim to this unregulated overconsumption of wildlife. And it was then kind of in the early 20th century when a group of conservationists, Aldo Leopold, Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, they came together and said, we need to set regulations on hunters, and we need to better manage wildlife. And I think to say the mountain lion, where in the mid 1900s they were pretty much blinked out from the western and eastern parts of the U.S. and hunters kind of sat down and said, "Hey, we really enjoy chasing mountain lions. They're a huge part of our culture and our livelihood, and we want to see them conserved." So it was kind of in that early 1970s era that we saw a shift in how wildlife was managed, and mountain lions and other predators were no longer kind of regarded as this, this animal that could be poisoned and wasted. And there was regulations, and from that, Jesse, stemmed kind of the resurgence of mountain lions into the West, and today they're extremely abundant. Another example I like to point out is waterfowl. Ducks and geese. In 1917, Canada signed on to kind of an extension of the Migratory Waterfowl Act. And what that did is that created a funding mechanism as well as a protection status for waterfowl all the way up into the Canadian Arctic, where they migrate and fledge and nest. And it set installed a management system where waterfowl were prioritized from the prairie pothole habitat that they depend in. There was a lot of resources that were concentrated in conserving ducks, and we think about Ducks Unlimited and what they've done for not just ducks and geese, but also amphibians and songbirds that use those same habitats. And that same message translates to large mammals. I think about wild sheep, and in British Columbia specifically, just a few weeks ago, the Wild Sheep Foundation held their annual conference, which was virtual this year because of COVID. But they were able to raise $285,000 for a bighorn sheep tag, one tag in British Columbia. And from that revenue generated, there's going to be a bunch of projects that go back into conserving sheep habitat, and just a whole suite of other research initiatives that don't just conserve mountain sheep, but also kind of have this ecosystem level conservation approach.
That was a beautiful and thoughtful answer. You started this interview with a land acknowledgement, and you contrasted, sort of the settler culture, colonial approach to hunting that came across and came west across Canada, the United States. So I know your work has touched upon Indigenous communities, First Nations, and American Indian communities connecting with conservation organizations to really bring their ethos to bear on the sort of planning and decision making. How is that going? Are we, as a country here in Canada, are we doing really concrete positive action to ensure that Indigenous communities get a say in conservation decisions? Is there an example of this that we can point to, like the examples you just gave?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Jesse. That's extremely important. And you're correct. Indigenous people have been conserving and managing wildlife for thousands of years, far before Europeans showed up, and far before Aldo Leopold and Gifford Pinchot started, working to reverse kind of that rapid exploitation of wildlife that we saw just in a few short decades. So absolutely, Indigenous people have a role in conserving wildlife. And in Canada, no, that's an interesting question about, how is Canada treating reconciling Indigenous people? And I would say that I would kind of give Canada maybe a C+ to B- grade on how that's going. Yeah. I think that Canada's done a lot of great things, but I think that there's a lot more they can do. But to focus on the positive and kind of the pathway forward, I would mention some of the ongoing work to conserve woodland caribou in Canada, one of Canada's most iconic species, and also a species incredibly important to Indigenous people.
Fantastic, Mateen. Again, great examples. One of the interviews that I'm hoping to do in the next few weeks is with a friend of mine, Andrea Reid. She was just started the Center for Indigenous Fisheries at University of British Columbia. So BC is leading the charge in this across Canada. Lauren Eckert also did an interview a few weeks back talking about some of the work on the island. So it's really heartening to hear that there's some positive stories. Even if we're at a C+ level right now, we're on the way to hopefully eventually getting an A.
Totally.
So, Mateen, one of the sort of to wrap up this interview, the thing that you've touched upon a lot is the need to preserve large tracts of habitat, the ecosystem level approach to conservation. And so I know you've had the pleasure of working in Lake Revelstoke Valley in British Columbia. I know that your work's been lauded by the Yellowstone to Yukon Wildlife Initiative. And so can you speak a little bit to the need to have these large tracts of wildlife or corridors and why that's so important?
Definitely. So I have had the great privilege of working with organizations like Yellowstone to Yukon, and they advocate for a lot of things that I share in my conservation ethos of collaborative approaches to wildlife management and conservation, as well as kind of creating large tracts of connected habitat from the Yellowstone to Yukon region. And my project for my master's thesis doesn't necessarily focus on per se like connectivity, but it does focus on bringing back, or it does focus on the caribou recovery file, which in the Lake Revelstoke Valley, to conserve the North Columbia caribou herd, which is in a lot worse shape than many other imperiled caribou herds in British Columbia, including the Klinziza. So I have been, working with Indigenous partners to try and understand their perspectives, their management priorities on the landscape, and to try and incorporate that into any kind of upshot or kind of next steps for how to best conserve caribou in the Lake Revelstoke Valley, which my project is specifically focusing on moose reduction, so reducing moose to help caribou. And I'll just quickly explain that. So caribou kind of indirectly compete, moose kind of indirectly compete with caribou, where when we've had these, kind of new logging and habitat disruption and disturbance that we've seen in the last 100 or so years, it's created really good habitat for moose and deer. So moose and deer have expanded northward in British Columbia and Alberta at rates that they wouldn't without humans. And when they've expanded northward, they've brought with them wolves. And the wolves, in consequence to kind of setting up shop in these new habitats, they also prey on endangered caribou, which didn't evolve quite as well as moose and deer to defend themselves from wolves. So a strategy that the province is employing is to reduce moose populations, to then reduce wolf density, to then help caribou. So as you can imagine, Jesse, that it is a contentious management lever to pull, but it is an important one. And my master's project is looking at that, and specifically looking at what kind of habitat are moose selecting or avoiding for in the Lake Revelstoke Valley, and what will the Lake Revelstoke Valley look like in 10 or 20 years when the habitat has changed for moose? What does that mean for moose, for First Nations hunters who depend on them, as well as caribou recovery?
I think we couldn't have ended with a more beautiful answer to loop together all the threads of this whole interview. So thank you so much, Mateen. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me today. And I hope that this our conversation today sparks a lot of conversations, a lot of further interest in following up on these stories, understanding the role Indigenous people have to play in conservation in Canada, and the role that hunters and anglers can play in making sure that these ecosystems are protected for decades and centuries to come. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.